good afternoon from Nigeria. My name is Samuel Drosharo. I'm a senior lecturer at the Department of Animal Breeding and Genetics, Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta in Nigeria. And my area of interest is behavioral genetics. I basically work on chickens, gallus, and turkeys, Meleagris gallopavo. So you are all welcome to Animal Welfare Group Nigeria with the acronym AWGN. So you will have been seeing us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, talking about animal welfare and behavior. So this group was founded in 2019 after a gathering of students and lecturers at the Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta, Ogun State in Nigeria. And in this group, we have 3 missions. The first one is to increase awareness about animal welfare and behavior in Nigeria, Africa, and in the world at large. The second mission is to foster collaboration and networking among researchers who are into the field of animal behavior and welfare. And the third one is to educate the public on the importance of animal welfare. So the third one, we do that a lot on our social media. So we are always talking about animal welfare, animal behavior, the need to cater for our animals, one welfare, and a lot of things. So we do that a lot on LinkedIn and on Twitter, and I hope we all enjoy that. So we meet every first and third Wednesdays of every month to discuss issues that are related to animal welfare and behavior. And people from different parts of the world have presented on issues that are related to ethical practices, slaughtering, fear, neuroscience, stress, archery practices, one welfare, open science, big data, positive welfare, assessment of animal welfare, and others in animals. And when I say animal, I mean livestock, wildlife, pets, and fish. So we're also trying to bring in people that work on insect behavior and welfare. So experts work on insect behavior and welfare starting from next year. And today's presentation will be the 10th in the virtual inaugural lecture series. We have prominent scientists that have presented to us, people like Mark Luthers, Temple Grandin, Pa Jensen, Lisa Young, Bas Rodenberg, Donald Bloom, Tina Widowski, and Ruth Newberry. And today's presenter is Professor Janice Siegford from Michigan State University, United States of America. Janice will be talking on how do we study cage-free laying hen behavior and what does that mean for their welfare. So today's moderator is Dr. Oluwaseun Yasere from the Department of Animal Physiology, Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta. So she's our moderator today. I want to hand over to her to continue the meeting. So Seun, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for introducing the meeting. Welcome everybody once again, and thank you for joining us. We have a presenter, Professor Janice Siegford from the Michigan State University, and I would like to take her biography. Dr. Janice Siegford is a professor in the Animal Behavior and Welfare Group in the Department of Animal Science at Michigan State University and the Associate Chair of Graduate Programs and Research for the department. Her education combines training in animal welfare during her postdoc, neuroscience during her doctorate degree, and zoology during her master's, and science communication during the BSc program. So she has a wide knowledge about different aspects of animals and animal welfare. Dr. Siegford's research examines the impact of management practices and housing environment on the behavior and welfare of laying hens and swine. Her research on laying hens in cage-free systems has examined the impact of genetics, rearing environment, space needed for behavior, feather pecking, and floor laying, as well as collaboration to develop a body-worn sensor for detecting hen behavior and location. Her most recent research involves mitigating the problem of floor laying by examining the impact of various management strategies on this behavior, including the use of robots in the litter area and computer vision to detect mislaid eggs. And just recently in August, she was appointed the new ISA president. So you're welcome, Janice, to our midst.
Well, thank you guys for inviting me to speak to the group today. I'm excited to be talking in Africa this morning, or this afternoon for my time. And I've had a very nice introduction. So here's the title of my talk. We'll be looking into the details on studying cage-free laying hen behavior and then trying to connect it to welfare. So I wanted to put this slide up just to show, especially the students in the group, the journey in academia is not always a straightforward one, and you may start in a different place than you end up. I started as a journalism major and thought I was going to write for National Geographic. And then I decided I really wanted to actually get into the science and understand how behavior worked. And I did that first with a degree in zoology, working on parakeets, budgerigars, then in neuroscience, actually looking at spinal motoneurogenesis with gerbils. But I got a taste for applied animal behavior work in the College of Vet Med's Behavior Service. Then I finally moved to Michigan State, where I really dove into welfare. And I started with pigs and early weaning stress and gene expression in the brain, which related back to my PhD. On the right, you can see now the things that I'm up to in red at the bottom of this screen, but I've worked on species ranging from beef and dairy cattle to pigs, to laying hens, and a whole lot of random zoo animals, horses, and cats and dogs in between as well. So it's not a straightforward path, and you can always sort of reshape yourself and come up with new interests, is kind of my take home there. So I'm just going to pose a question to you. And so I want you to picture in your head what you think of when you hear the term cage-free. And this is important because I want to start this discussion with a definition of what I'm talking about when I say this, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So when you're thinking of cage-free, are you thinking that the hens have outdoor access? And are you thinking about whether or not they have a lot of space per bird? Okay. And I'm asking this because when in the US, when we poll the public and say, what does it mean when you hear the term cage-free? This is really what they think of. And that is not quite maybe what we're thinking of. I have to share this picture. This was on a fairly recent trip to the University of Hawaii. And here we have some cage-free chickens. Actually, I would say that they're free range. And I found this interesting. We had feral hens wandering on the island. But so anyway, these concepts of cage-free in the public in the US, they really do encompass kind of this outdoor environment, natural behaviors, lots of space and resources for hens. So that's how the public interprets that term. However, when we're typically using the term cage-free in legislation or research, or thinking about standards and trying to figure out what systems are what, there's a difference between cage-free and free range. So the system I'm showing here is a system where the hens have large space. They can go in and out of this tiered system down to a litter area. They may have groups that run the whole length of the barn. And so this is what we actually mean in a technical sense when we're talking about cage-free. So the birds have bigger space, but they're still completely indoors essentially. When we're talking about free range in the US and in many other parts of the world, we then go to a space where we're actually talking about chickens having access to the outdoors. Now, I'll also say that cage-free is different from the terms organic and pasture-raised. So organic does imply some level of outdoor access, but not necessarily very high quality access to outdoors. And it's not necessarily a priority to verify that all the hens are going out and using that space. Pasture raised, on the other hand, is maybe even a step beyond free range, where we're really talking about hens being outside most of the time and having quite a bit of space per bird, and maybe even having a certain quality of environment. So that distinction hopefully now is in your head and in place, and I'll be interested to talk to you later about whether or not the definition I just posed for cage-free matches up with what you think. So here's kind of some of the reality of commercial cage-free in the US. The picture on the left showing this kind of bird's eye view of a farm shows the scale of the barns that we can have in the US, where we can have literally a barn that is maybe 400 meters long and may house anywhere from tens of thousands of birds to perhaps 100,000 or 200,000 birds, sometimes even more, depending on the width and the type of the system internally. The pictures on the right show some of the different designs for cage-free. So what you'll hopefully get a sense of, especially compared to the previous picture, is that it can come in many configurations in terms of how we provide space and resources to hens indoors. There can even be flat floor pen systems with raised slats and nests in the center, but those are typically used more in conjunction with free range. So this cage-free system that I've just popped up here illustrates one of the conundrums that we face when we use the term cage-free and then show a naive person the system. To me and to a lot of people who see these for the first time, they kind of just look like large cages. And so I sometimes feel that when we're using this term, we may open ourselves up to problems in interpretation because of that potential disconnect in terms of what you see and how it resonates with your use of the term cage. Okay, so there's the backstory. So why do we want to house hens in cage-free systems? Why are we seeing this move? Well, there's certainly a big push from kind of a social acceptability perspective, right? Especially within the US, within Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. There's a fair number of countries where public expectation is very similar to what I put forth for the US consumer. And so there's this idea that we should be doing better for animals in terms of raising them in ways that are natural. And we also maybe have a little bit of an issue where we have this negative perception of caging, right? Where we see these systems where hens are in small spaces without a lot of resources that allow them to perform natural behavior, right? So we have this public expectation that the hens are perhaps living in these gorgeous little, chicken deluxe mansions. And so when consumers see the reality of the intent systems versus what they're envisioning, it causes a problem. And we also have a growing issue where the majority of at least Americans, their exposure to animals is as pets rather than is in a livestock or agricultural setting. And so we have a difficult time sometimes reconciling friends and food or how friends can become food. So we have certainly this social aspect that is in many cases driving why we are trying to get hens out of cages and into these cage-free systems. There also, from my perspective as a behaviorist, there are some important ethological reasons why we should maybe move to systems that let hens do behavior as part of production, right? So if we can actually develop systems that work with hens' innate, strongly motivated behaviors, maybe the birds will be easier to manage, right? And maybe will actually enhance their fitness. So we can improve their welfare, but also simultaneously, hopefully, improve the product by reducing stress and then therefore like drain on their immune system or on their ability to grow and reproduce. So, there's some things that we know in terms of what hens like to do if we watch hens in a free range or a feral or even, the ancestral species, the jungle fowl. If we look in those situations, we can get a sense of what things are natural for hens, how they like to do those natural things. So here I have one with the hens roosting in trees, so roosting at height to escape predators. It's not just sitting on a perch and wrapping the toes around. There's a height element to that feeling of safety. And then red jungle fowl are ground nesting birds, and so are the modern laying hens. So when we think about where we put nests in these systems, how does that synchronize with where the hen wants to lay her eggs? So ultimately, of course, hopefully these things will lead to better hen welfare. So thinking again more maybe intensely, what do chickens need to do to be able to live like chickens? And how do we incorporate these important behaviors into the cage-free system? So I've mentioned nesting. So that is something that we know that hens are strongly motivated to do, although our modern genetic strains like the leghorns have been selected not to brood and to continue to lay eggs rather than to stop, form a clutch, incubate it, and hatch. But they still often have a desire for many of the features that are important for a nest: seclusion, darkness, privacy. Hens like to forage, so they'll spend a great deal of their awake time wandering around, pecking for things, scratching and exploring, even if they're not actively consuming all of this stuff that they're looking at while they're foraging. We know that they have a strong diurnal dust bathing pattern, where typically in the afternoons, they're going to seek out spots for dust bathing. And they like to do this about every 48 hours. And it can take about 20 to 25 minutes for a complete dust bath. I mentioned roosting already, but perching, where they're actually able to sit at height and kind of wrap their feet around, is important for settled resting behavior, particularly at night. And then they also may need to do certain other enjoyable behaviors. These are some hens fighting over a small grass snake. So this is not great for the grass snake's welfare, but it also indicates maybe some natural predatory behavior or play behavior, positive aspects of welfare that we also need to consider. So those are some of the things that, as we think about these cage-free systems and we think about whether they're actually improving welfare, we need to keep in our heads as we're thinking about these systems. So how do we know if they're succeeding, right? The whole intent and the push in terms of either legislation or consumer initiatives is driven by this desire to improve the hens' welfare by letting them out of these small, barren cages and into these bigger systems with more complexity and opportunities for socialization and behavior. But how do we know if they're working, right? Do we know that the designs that the engineers have come up with are working the way that they should for these hens? Are there unintended consequences as a result of putting these hens in these big groups, in these complicated environments, often with a lot of vertical navigation that they have to do? And are all the things chickens do good behaviors? And if we give them more freedom to behave, are there things that we're going to see that are negative, such as the piling that these white hens are showing on the left-hand side of that picture, or the feather pecking that they're showing on the right? So those are important things to think about, right? We can't just think if we get rid of the cage, everything gets universally better throughout. So we have to study this, right? We have to look at what the hens are actually doing in these systems in order to see how they're using the systems and if that naturalness and that ethological freedom is really helping. So we have some great opportunities to see a lot more in cage-free systems than we could ever see in cages. We have social groups, and so we can see complex patterns of social behavior and perhaps even cohorts forming. We can look at entire behavioral sequences that are happening over the course of a day and watch as hens move from feeding to nesting to dust bathing to resting, back to feeding, etc. We can look at those complex behavioral sequences also within that context, as I just mentioned, of the diurnal rhythms. We can look at how they develop behavior. So if we rear these laying hens in different environments, what kind of behaviors do they need to develop in order to move into the cage-free system? And then how does behavior further develop as they adapt to that adult environment? We can look at differences between strains of laying hens. So do brown versus white hens just generally act different? Are there differences depending on which company has been doing the breeding and the selection? Are there differences if we compare heritage breeds from different parts of the world that we need to consider? And I mentioned a little bit that influence of rearing environment, right? These birds are born in a precocial state. They're ready to go, but there's a lot of important things they have to learn at an early age in order to be able to do those things well as adults. And so how do we give them those opportunities to learn before we put them into that adult environment? And how can we optimize our management routine to work with all of these complicated behaviors and their rhythms in order to facilitate them laying in the nests where we want them to lay, to prevent things like piling behavior? What do we do as we humans work in the system to help create to optimize that cage-free environment? And then how and how much of resources do we provide, right? So if we know they need to nest, we know they need to perch, we know they need to dust bathe, it's not simply enough to throw those resources in. We have to know where to provide them, how much to provide them, and maybe even what configurations, right? But when we're looking in these systems, as you've seen from those earlier pictures, it's a big environment. How do you conduct behavioral observations with hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of birds and really get a clear picture of what's happening? And then it's complex. There's often really tall tiers. How can I see everything from the floor level all the way up to that highest element? And how can I see in across a system that's multiple meters deep, especially when the hen closest to me may be blocking my view of the hen behind? Again, large sizes. How do I keep track of individual animals over time in a group like that, especially if they all look alike because they're maybe all brown hens or all white hens? Does the density prevent me from seeing certain things because the birds are going to overlap with each other and block my field of view or prevent each other from doing things? And if we've got litter on the floor, we're going to have dust being kicked up. We're also going to have things potentially like ammonia and moisture that are going to mess with my recording equipment. And then when we're dealing with laying hens, it's not a nice, quick six-week cycle or even 2-month cycle like it is for broiler chickens. We're talking about at least a year in these systems. And how do we really track the long-term effects, which are really important as we think about how fragile these hens get in terms of losing calcium in their bones and issues with keels and bone breaks as they age. So we have to really think about how we get at these questions as we're going forward. So I want to, hopefully this video will work. I've got some pictures and videos of our current flock at MSU to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about when we talk about things that are difficult. So this is a Natura 60 system for Big Dutchman. And as you can see, the hens can get out toward the bottom. This is just one of our rooms at MSU. We only have 144 hens per unit and 576 hens per room. That's still a lot of birds to keep track of. And you could see if I was going in and trying to count how many hens were doing different behaviors in different parts of that system, it's really, really tricky because there's so much going on. So here's some other constraints that we find sometimes when we're trying to conduct live behavior observations in the system. The hens like to help out. These brown birds that we're working with now are quite bold, and the 2 birds you see here have flown down to perch on our recording equipment. So in one case, hen landed on my clipboard, and in another, we had one land on our iPad that we were using for data collection. So sometimes they actually, there's observer bias, right? Not in a negative way with these birds, but because they're altering our behavior out of curiosity. And of course, whenever we're doing stuff with hens in the system, like leg banding, you can see the leg band on the hen being held here. Whatever we do that might alter their appearance in the system could also potentially alter their behavior toward each other, especially if you put something shiny in there or with loose flappy straps like our little chicken backpacks. And sometimes even when we're simply doing egg collection, they're very helpful in that regard too. And sometimes we may end up with accidentally damaged eggs as they fly down and land on our flats when we're collecting. So there's challenges both in terms of getting into these systems and seeing things, the scale of the system, and also trying not to interfere with the birds or have them interfere with us as we're collecting the data. So how do we get around this to get some good data out of these systems to really understand what's going on, what works, what doesn't, and what we might need to adjust? So my solution has been to use a variety of approaches. So you could mix live observation with video, right? If you collect data live, you get everything instantly, you've got all the data, but your presence, your very presence may cause problems, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, and it can take a while to habituate the hens. And maybe if you're looking at key developmental things, by the time you're habituated, the developmental window has passed. You could use video, and we do a lot of top-down video, but then you have to decode it, and decoding is really time-consuming. You also can't get cameras that can see everywhere. We have struggled and struggled and struggled and failed over the years to get nest box cameras that let us see inside these long colony nests where we can have dozens of hens at the same time. But the systems are low and long, and whenever I put a camera in, some bird inevitably blocks it. So we can also think then about, okay, humans versus technology. So if I have an experienced human doing my live observation or video decoding, their brains can pretty rapidly process what they're seeing and interpret it. And of course, we can train people to make sure they're consistent. On the other hand, technology can do some things that we can't, like detecting the gravitational force as a hen falls and potentially crashes, seeing in the dark with some of our super sensitive cameras now, or collecting 3D information about the hens in space. Pros and cons to both, right? They have their strengths and weaknesses. And sometimes there's limitations in the system that may push you in one way or the other. Then there's also what kind of data we're collecting. So do we want really descriptive data about what's happening to the birds in their actual world? So are we just going in and recording what we see in the environment versus manipulating it through experimental studies, where we can have targeted tests of hypothesis, but we're often working with individual hens or smaller groups of hens and maybe in a test situation. And then what kind of level of detail do we want? Are we really focusing on describing all the behaviors we see or recording them, how often they happen and for how long and when? Or are we simply noting where the birds are in space, what space they're occupying or what resources they're actually engaged with, which is simpler. And then welfare is something that happens to an individual bird. It is that animal's experience. But we house these animals in huge flocks and they interact with each other. So what level is the right level to collect data at? And how can we track those individual hens in these big systems where we could potentially lose sight of them or not be able to find them again to get the sensor back off if we're using a sensor? And if we mark a hen so that we can find her, does that influence how other birds interact with her? On the other hand, if we're doing a flock and we just have averages, are we missing the tails of very poor and very good welfare? And then what scale, right? So at our MSU farm, we have groups of about 150 in each of our pens and rooms full of birds from 500 to 600 birds. But in a commercial environment, it's much, much larger. So how do things scale up and what are the problems there? So I've done research in all these different areas, but because we've got limited time, I'm going to really focus on this part here, looking at how we can use human senses or technology or both to try to get some pictures of what's going on. So when I actually first got into looking at laying hens and their behavior, it was because the dean of my college said, hey, we should be able to go into a barn and listen to what the hens sound like and get a sense of whether they're happy or not happy. So I started actually with acoustics, which turned out to be a little bit difficult at the time. But I happened to meet a really great engineering colleague, and we started to work on some body-worn sensors. My whole goal was, could we please automate the detection of behavior so that my students don't have to spend zillions of hours decoding video? So I was hoping for automated, remote, non-invasive data collection so I could really capture what was happening in a very detailed way with these hens over 24 hours without all the video. So we started work on a sensor, and this shows kind of the size of this little sensor that we fit in backpacks on the hen. And it was essentially a little tiny sensor with an accelerometer built in, and it could also send and receive signals so you could tell where it was in the barn relative to fixed base stations. And so some of our initial work looked at, could we identify from the different kinds of acceleration that were happening in the X and Y axis, could we use these signatures to distinguish among some important chicken behaviors, right? So could we tell if they were dust bathing or pecking on each other, or if they were feeding or preening? And we started to do some looking at this, and we noticed, of course, that some behaviors are very high activity, like dust bathing, and others, the more static behavior, look a bit different. But this is still pretty messy, right? You can't just tell by looking at the type of the peaks that we're getting here exactly what's happening. So dust bathing, for example, might be confounded with pecking. These two peaks look almost identical. and sitting and lying behavior look pretty similar. And sometimes even preening could look very similar. So we needed to go a little bit further. So could we get them to be more accurate with identifying important behaviors? How did we have to tweak our algorithms or the technology itself? So what we started doing was, okay, let's plot this in a different way. So here we're looking at a feature called entropy instead. And you can see that we get some clusters that look a little bit more promising, right? There's some distinct things that are falling out, right? Walking and running looks pretty distinct from the other stuff that's happening. And if you couple the y-axis in, you can also start to pull out dust bathing and really stationary behaviors like sitting and sleeping. But what you'll notice is there's a lot of overlap between feeding and drinking. And so when we did a matrix to try and tell how accurate we were at classifying things, so all the stuff on the diagonal, whoops, is what we got right, and all of the stuff that's off the diagonal is what we got wrong. So here you can see that we are inaccurately classifying a lot of feeding behavior as drinking behavior. Well, why is that? So feeding behavior and drinking behavior, when they're done naturally, they're pretty similar, right? The hen lowers her head and she dips her beak into something. And then in the case of drinking, she may raise her head again to swallow. And in the case of feeding, she may repetitively peck. So you would think that if we were looking at natural drinking behavior, perhaps we could use the repetitive pecking of the feeding versus the kind of tilting for the drinking to separate those. Well, if we were using a natural drinking source, a body of water, we could, but we're usually not. And so here, when we have nipple drinkers, we have pecking motions now for feeding and for drinking. And so now it gets really hard to tell these two behaviors apart because there's this kind of motion. So ultimately, what we needed to do in this case was to add a third axis so we could do a bit better nuance in terms of telling apart the direction of the pecking behavior. So there's promise, right? But it's not easy. These groups of studies we did here were probably, we started in 2008. So it was 4 years making to get to this data. Okay, so maybe it's going to be difficult to train the sensors to detect behaviors, but maybe there's other things they could help us with. Maybe instead we could use the sensor to detect the hen's location in the barn and then focus the human's effort on observing some of the behavior. So this figure that I've just put up here, we were using the sensors to detect the hen's locations in a small pen environment. So we have an array of feeders down here. We've got nest boxes, we've got a drinker line up top, and we've got perches in the middle. And so what you can see here is hotspot maps of 2 different hens. And you can see that by using the sensor, we reveal some pretty interesting individual differences in how they use space. So the red here shows where the hen spends most of her time. So hen 1 and hen 2 don't really overlap very much in terms of where they're spending most of their time in this environment. So maybe they have niches in their environment, which is pretty cool to think about. So then we added a layer of human decoding of what were they doing in those different places. And we found that this one shows preening behavior. And so not surprisingly, we also see differences in terms of where these birds are doing their preening behavior. And they're doing that in different areas as well. So we see one hen number 1 is doing most of her preening on a litter area in the back of the system, whereas hen 2 seems to be doing most of her preening on the perch array or near the feeders. So we could kind of couple both the human and the technology in order to get some pretty interesting data. So one of the things we also were able to do with a sensor was to look at how the space use of the entire group of hens changed over time. So this represents some data from earlier in the laying cycle at 48 weeks, and then almost 20 weeks later at 66 weeks, almost near the very end of the cycle. And what you can see is for these 4 hens that are shown here in the different colors, their patterns in some cases change quite a bit. The green hen is probably the most stable, but the other birds changed fairly dramatically from 48 weeks to 66 weeks. And this graph here ends up showing basically how much their home range changed in size. So in some cases, at 48 weeks, the blue bar, we see a bigger home range and smaller at 66 weeks, right? But there are some cases where the situation is actually reversed. So we did have a few hens that actually changed their pattern. The data from room 2, which is what is shown in these graphs over here, you see the pattern that I mentioned, where in most cases, the range was either decreasing or staying the same, except for Y08, which was that green hen I mentioned, who actually increased her space over time. Perhaps she was the dominant bird. Okay, another way we've been able to use these accelerometer type sensors is to really estimate what's happening in these systems at night. So my colleague and I, Ahmed Ali, we noticed in a live observation study that when we were counting hens at the beginning of a night versus at the end of a night, they weren't staying in exactly the same place overnight, which is what we thought was happening. And in most cases, there were fewer hens up top in the morning right before lights came on than at night. So we started wondering whether they were falling in these systems, if somehow they were slipping or being pushed and lost their balance and fell in the systems at night. So we were really curious to see whether this was happening and whether or not it was actually a fall or a controlled movement downwards. So again, we use these little sensors, a slightly different one this time, an off-the-shelf version, put them in these little backpacks and fit them around the hen's body using straps and Velcro to keep things in place. And we have done some studies to assess whether they affect the hens or not. And then we have the sensor data that shows us what's happening, right? And so this is from hens with 3 different treatments relative to how early they were introduced to the aviary and whether they had experience with vertical height. And you can see that there's treatment differences that are being picked up in terms of the collision force. Birds that never had seen vertical structures until they were about 27 weeks of age showed the most force, but the smallest fall distance. And what we found was these floor birds typically weren't falling very far at night, but when they fell hard. Whereas our birds that had a lot of vertical structure, but not necessarily in the aviary, they were falling further, but often had less force, so they seemed to be breaking. Or perhaps it was more of a controlled movement. So how did we know for sure that this was happening? Because we're just using an accelerometer that's tracking force. It's not tracking location. Well, what we did was, so here's that data again, just from the enriched birds. So we had 6 birds that we recorded as falling, and we said that they were falling quite far, probably from about the top level or the top perch in the environment. Well, we did some live observations of these focal birds. And so this shows here, each bird is with a different symbol. 6 is the highest point that she could rest on, and 1 is basically the bottom level in the system. And what you hopefully see is at the beginning of the night and at the end of the night, the birds are all in the same location. But of course, what you see is not perfectly that, and here are the 6 birds that fell. So our live observation basically provided really great confirmation that what we were seeing in the sensors was in fact that these birds were falling quite a big distance, that there were 6 total downward movements, and that in one case it was lower from a different area. So we've also then did some live observations to simply see where these hens were what these hens were doing at different points, and discovered, other things like different patterns of overall system use, even during the day, in these birds that had experience with different environments. So another thing we've looked at is, tools that we can use to measure things accurately from screen captures. So here we were measuring exactly how wide hens were when they were perching. And if any of you know your standard European or US regulations, we say 15 centimeters of perch width per hen. You'll notice that even the smallest measurements in our study were above 15, and in many cases, almost 10 centimeters above 15. So we were using these tools to really accurately assess how much space hens were taking up. And then here we did that with dust bathing as well, because hens do some really dynamic and important behaviors in these systems. How do we know how much space to give them, or how much resource per hen to give them? So then we can take some of this information and then put it into context. Okay, so if dust bathing takes a lot of space, how often does dust bathing happen and when? So if we're thinking about how much litter area to provide, what do we have to worry about? So my grad student Tessa was looking at a hen dust bathing and how the presence of other birds around her either stopped her from dust bathing or changed the amount of space she took while dust bathing. And what she basically found was that for the brown birds, the highlines and the bovans here, they dust bathed for less time, and they basically would stop dust bathing if hens got closer than about 15 centimeters, whereas white hens would dust bathe for longer, and birds could get much closer to them before they would stop dust bathing. And what they would do in response to other hens getting close was to take up less space rather than stop altogether. Okay, so then we can think also about some other things in terms of timing and pattern and space. And again, connecting that to how it might affect our design or management or standards. So here are those same birds, and we're looking at patterns of the gray bars are how many hens are on the litter. The black lines are how many hens are dust bathing. So it looks like we have a clear circadian pattern in the white hens for the most dust bathing happening right away when hens could go down to the litter. And in the brown birds, there's less of a tight pattern, but there's fewer hens dust bathing overall. So if you're running a system with white birds, do you need to provide more litter space because they want to synchronize and because they dust bathe in higher numbers? All right, so we're almost to the end of the data here. So these videos are, on the left, we have a 3D camera that is looking at how much vertical space the hen uses while wing flapping. And the bottom screen here shows the system measuring her highest points in red at various times. Because if hens are supposed to be able to extend their wings in a system without touching anything, what does that really mean? And in order to understand that, we should look at the behavior they do when their wings are most fully extended, which is wing flapping. So what we found, is that our average max height is about 51 centimeters, but this is a problem when we have systems that sometimes provide birds with underneath the system litter space that is maybe less than this or right at that. Is a hen going to want a wing flap if she's that tight? So you can also see here that there's variation again in wing flapping. So in this case, actually, our brown birds are doing the most wing flapping compared to the white hens. But again, they tend to like to do it right away when they got access to the litter in the morning. So again, thinking about how that impacts management. So I know I'm about at the end of time here, and I know we want some time for questions. So I'm just going to really quickly make a couple points about moving from behavior to welfare. So when we think about welfare, right, we have to think about what exactly we mean here. And those of you that are on this call really understand, I think, the importance of defining this and thinking about how we're interpreting this with respect to the animal and what that then implies for what things we're looking at and what resources we're providing to facilitate it. So, oops, it looks like my slide went a little wonky here, but basically, right, we're trying to get at this idea that it's more holistic than just production and just health, and that many of these aspects of welfare relate to behavior, right? So in many of the definitions that we're all familiar with from a scientific standpoint, behavior is explicitly considered within that welfare realm. So, and of course, that makes sense because hens' behaviors have functions, right? Their behaviors are helping them meet their physiological needs, which gives them good physical health. Their behaviors are helping them recover from health challenges, which also, again, influences their physiological health and also will have impacts on their productivity. And then, of course, hens' behaviors can either indicate whether they feel good or they're maybe driven to do behaviors that feel good. And they can also be important in terms of how hens are communicating with each other in terms of soliciting contact from other birds or trying to deter things like aggression, right? So we can really see how a hen is feeling physically from a health perspective and from an emotional perspective by looking at those behaviors, which then connects to how she's doing in terms of welfare. But of course, the interpretation is not always straightforward, right? It's not always, if we see this behavior, it means this for welfare. So one thing that's really important is thinking about when we're trying to do all this behavior quantification, what's the baseline comparison to know if seeing this behavior, is it enough? Is it too much? Is it too little? What does it actually translate to for welfare, right? So when we're observing, how is it weighing on this scale? So if we take foraging, and let's say our target is she spends 50% of her time foraging, and that means that's enough for good welfare. If we're only seeing 5% foraging in the system, even if it's better than zero, maybe it doesn't mean good welfare. Whereas if she's spending 85% of her time foraging, what is she also not doing instead? And does that mean she's hungry because she's trying to prioritize foraging that much? So in other cases, of course, if we detect problem behaviors, such as this smothering or piling that results in smothering and death, or feather pecking that results in problems for the birds, can we actually do something about it? Do we actually have proven strategies or approaches that we're going to be able to use to mitigate this problem, especially if it's a problem that we're trying to correct rather than prevent? So basically, the cage-free is not an automatic improvement. We have to use a lot of variation in how we study it to understand it. And we still have some work to do to make some very clear connections in terms of what the behavior tells us about welfare in that moment, and then how do we go about linking that to advice for improving. And then we have to keep our minds open to all alternative systems and methods, because cage-free, I don't think, is anywhere close to perfect. And hopefully we'll be able to think about other kinds of things that we can do in other areas that meet the needs of hens that might be different from the ones that we've been studying currently. So there we go.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Janice, for this insightful presentation. It's quite interesting to learn about how the use of technologies, can help detect one or two behavior, and also to address some welfare issues, especially when it comes to management, knowing the amount of space that is required by the hen to perform the different behaviors that is very, very important to them. So I'm still expecting questions in the chat box. Yet, okay. There is a question here from Samuel Durosharon. How best can issues like keel bone fractures be mitigated in cage-free systems?
So yeah, this is a tricky one, because to some extent, because of the way maybe hens are laying and because of bone fragility, we're not going to be able to entirely do away with it, because we still see keel bone fractures even in caged hens, right? So we can't necessarily entirely do away with it in a cage-free system. But if we rear the hens in environments where they can develop the spatial navigation abilities in terms of both cognitive skills and physical ability, that's going to help keep them from like impact crashes, for example, and make them better able to move in the system without extra injury. So I think if we can prepare them to move well in the system, we can at least mitigate problems that come about as a result of collisions or falls or things like that.
Okay, thank you so much. Mm-hmm. But if there is still the possibility of cage hens to have keel bone fracture, then what actually, I think it's a complicated issue. So is it that research is yet to really understand the real cause or something?
Well, I think, some of it may simply be like when a bird even just flaps her wings, she puts strain on the keel, right? And if the keel is super fragile, is that enough to cause a fracture? There's also been one group that has postulated the idea that even the act of laying might be responsible for keel tip fractures as the egg passes by that tip of the keel. And then certainly when we see hens perch, there might be deviations or damage that can occur based on incorrect perch configuration or hard materials. And there's certainly a genetic component and a nutrition component, right? And so there's those elements that we can't ignore either. We can't just fix the behavior and not deal with some of those other things.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, we still have questions. I think the questions are now coming.
Yeah, so I'll answer Lucas's. So what are we working on right now? So the current project we have going on, we're actually trying to figure out how to encourage the hens to lay in the nest rather than the litter, because they like to go down on that nice litter that they can squish into a nice soft nest and lay their egg down there, especially if the nests are crowded, right? But for the producer, that means dirty eggs, broken eggs, lost eggs, more labor to collect the eggs. So how do we encourage them to lay the eggs in the right place, but not to stress them out while doing it? So are there strategies that we can use to train the hens early on to get them to go up to the nest when it's time to lay rather than choosing a spot in a litter? So that's one of the things that we're working on right now. And then we're continuing our work on the wing flapping. So we have 2 papers in preparation right now that from some of that data that I shared that will come out and really describe some of those patterns and the space occupancy. So that's a key.
Can I take you on that? Could there be a possibility that if a hen is afraid of falling, could that be a reason why they may not want to go up there to use the next box and might want to, lay on the litter?
Certainly in some systems, in many systems now that the nest is either at the very bottom tier level or just a little up slightly, and they've been adding things like ramps or hop platforms or intermediate perches to make it more of a stepwise process rather than a full flight or a big jump. So hopefully that will help. And early rearing with perches and with nests for the pullet phase can be really helpful in familiarizing the birds with those resources and making them comfortable with using them.
Okay, so the next question is also from Samuel. He's interested in the incidence of hens falling in the cage-free system. What are the potential causes of falls in hens?
Yeah, so in some cases it could be so in the system we were studying, there were these metal ledges that were slightly sloped that were there to help hens jump between, but the hens would sleep on them at night, and they were smooth metal and they were crowded. So you could see that maybe if a hen loses like muscle tension and relaxes and falls off, that could be one thing, because there was nowhere to grip in that particular case. In others, they do actually seem to move more than we thought they did, even in complete darkness. So if there is some moving going on at night for one reason or another, maybe they still are not quite accurate at where they're targeting their movement, and so they may miss. Because we found that even in the light, when hens move between areas, they crash about 20% of the time. So at night, it might even be a higher level because, again, their depth perception, like ours, might be thrown off a bit at night.
Okay, can I just take a follow-up question on that? Falling at night, since you used sensors to monitor where they slept and where you found them very early in the morning, what did you go ahead to try to see if these birds had any form of injury or showed any form of pain, to be sure or to know how painful that the falling actually is to them?
That would have been amazing, but we were in some ways so surprised to detect what we did that we had not really prepared. We couldn't instantly analyze the data to then go to that hen in particular and follow up with her. So that was a little bit, it took longer to bring the behavior and the sensor pieces together than we wanted, but that would be an amazing thing to do in future and would follow up some of that work that's been done before that's shown that fractures are painful. So yeah, if we'd been able to CT scan them right away or palpate them for signs of pain or do another assessment to look at whether they were moving differently in the day that followed, that would have been a brilliant follow-up. Yeah, unfortunately, we were not that far ahead of the thinking.
Yes, but the figure you showed about this falling at night, was it just for a day, or was the data collected just for a day? Or
we did over 3 days consecutively.
Over 3 days. Then
that pattern, that little pattern I showed with the individual hens and where they were before and after, that was 3 consecutive days with each hen. And we actually did that not only at mid-lay, but then later again at peak lay. So we actually repeated it as well, but with different birds.
So with different birds, but you never had maybe a set of data where you watched a particular set of birds maybe for 3 consecutive days?
So the problem with, so we did all of our data collection live, because when you're trying to video into the system, you are blocked in this particular system by the mesh on the outside. And so the cameras, especially at night, have a hard time focusing past that to see what the birds are doing. So it was only possible in this system at that time with the type of technology we had. So that was about 6 years ago, I think, that we did that one. 5 years ago, that we didn't have enough good low light cameras to really do what we needed to do there. That's been one of the trickiest parts with these aviary systems, is being able to use video to see in as well as the human can, because the human can be like peering around and trying to like see past the bodies of the.
Oops. Hello, Janice.
That is so right on for what we saw. So we'd taken groups of students out to tour the farms over the years. And I remember one year we took out a group of freshman students and we told them it was a cage-free facility. And then we walked them into the barn. And one of the guys turned and looked at me and goes, "But these are big cages." And I went, yes, they do look like big cages, don't they? Because you've got wire around them in many cases. And so it gives that perception of a cage. And some of the systems I've worked in, you can actually close that bottom door, and which does make it essentially a tall tiered cage with no litter on the floor. So I think that the poultry industry, by naming this cage free, has actually perhaps been disingenuous, or the public will think they are disingenuous when they call them this. I feel like that's a really real concern.
Yeah. I think I have a question here, and it has to do with pecking order. We know these birds, they have established a pecking order, but in a cage-free system, how is it like? And if they are not able to establish a pecking order, depending on, the number of chickens, what implication does it have in terms of maybe feather pecking and, aggression?
So, yeah, they do seem to shift strategies in terms of their behavior related to like who gets access to resources. So in a small group of, let's say, a dozen to maybe 25, 30 hens, they can establish a very clear dominance hierarchy that is pretty straightforward. This hen outranks this hen, outranks this hen, and the top hen always gets everything first. But once you get a group that's, I think Inma Estevez did some really nice work on this. And I think when you get around 60, all of that starts to break down. And so then the hens they have attributes physically that kind of indicate if they're dominant or likely to be a dominant hen. So size, body condition, perhaps the health of the comb, and of course the behavior signals that she's giving off. And so those signals seem to then indicate whether a hen is going to win an encounter over a resource. But it becomes much more about kind of resource competition rather than automatic access based on your place in the social hierarchy. So it does seem to break down, but I've always been really curious to figure out whether they form subgroups and whether there are still hierarchies within those subgroups in the bigger systems. And that's still something that I'm interested in. I just have not figured out how to do it without altering the behavior of the hens I'm looking at.
Okay, that's interesting. Subgroups within the flock, yeah. So there is a question here. What is the cost of the various sensors used in behavioral tracking, and how affordable is it?
Group that you see, they break down into these family groups. They don't just have this big homogeneous herd.
Thank you, Janice. What is the cost implication of getting these behavioral tracking devices?
So right now, there are not really commercially available systems for doing this with poultry. Well, I guess I should qualify that. There's infrared, I think, sensors that you can get in little bands. Gantner is a company that produces them. They initially did it for pigeons, but then there's a lot of groups like Mike Toscano's group at Bern and Jean-Lou's group out of Vienna, Jean-Loup Rault, and I think Maya Makagon at UC Davis have used those little infrared sensors to detect at least the movement of birds between areas. They're not economical for large scale on a per hen basis. But what one of the ideas is to do a sentinel population. So you could pick a subgroup of hens that you track over time to give you a metric of what's happening with the overall flock. One of the things I'm interested in is what's the right sentinel population, how many birds, and how do we select them so that we get that broad representation.
Yes, because
yeah, right now it's not feasible, and you know, the most I've seen them used is in fairly large research farms, not yet applied. Well, that's not true. Maybe some of the genetics companies might be using them more at scale in terms of selecting their really progenitor lines for those birds are worth a lot and they want a lot of information for genotyping and selection.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That really makes sense. So I think that has also answered Rukayat's question. So in a large population, there is a need to take a representative sample to watch the behavior of the birds. So don't think I've missed any question, but...
Oh, there's one on where should the sensor be attached? Yeah, so that is really important to think about because you need the sensor to stay stable and not actually affect and change the behavior of the bird when you've attached it. And then you also want it to detect the behaviors of interest, right? And so that is a tricky trifecta to hit. So the back is the place we've mounted most often. And that gives us pretty good stability and it lets it nestle into the feathers quite a bit. And we often try to camouflage it by matching with feather color so it doesn't stand out and become a pecking target. Initially, the engineers were like, we need to put an antenna out of the sensor. And I was like, if you stick something out that wiggles like that, this is not going to go well. So any of you that know chickens know that immediately if there's something little and wiggly that sticks out, right, what is going to happen? It is going to be very attractive. So, so the back is a good one. And they can also carry maybe a little more weight there. We found that it doesn't seem to affect behavior if you give them like a day to acclimate to carrying it and kind of getting their feathers settled under it. You'll see them do a lot of preening initially because they got to get those feathers kind of laid down correctly so they don't poke backwards and things. And we try when we're putting them on to smooth everything down too. But yeah, that's tricky. And so, you know, we actually initially explored the idea of putting something on the head too, but since the head is a target for aggressive pecking, bad idea, right? So as the sensors get smaller and smaller and you can tuck things under feathers and maybe even kind of like use some adhesive to attach them the way we do to a lot of wildlife when we tag like seals and dolphins and things like that, that might provide some more opportunities. So we're not at a perfect sensor or sensor attachment yet. So it's still a work in progress for sure.
That's amazing. But still on technology, I want to take you to robotics now. Mm-hmm. Because I was just trying to picture it out. If we have robots, you know, in the barn, probably helping doing one activity or the other, I was just wondering, do you think the birds will be able to differentiate between a real human and a robot? And, you know, when it now comes to this human-animal interaction, like you showed 2 pictures of when you were collecting the data and the birds actually, you know, jumped on you, at least you can still, you know, stroke them and do things like that. So how will it be when if we have robots, you know, helping out?
Yeah. I think it will still be important to get humans in the barn too, because otherwise the birds, if they're not used to the humans, even if we make the robot look human-ish, humans smell different and birds do have a good sense of smell. So of course they're going to detect that smell. They often learn to recognize individual humans before they generalize. So our birds, we have probably at least 10 people that are in there on a regular basis of all different heights and hair types and colors and glasses and skin tones and beards or no beards. Some of us wear the scarf like I do, some don't. So, but we all wear blue coveralls and black Crocs. And so I think our hens have now started to generalize to the outfit. So if we bring other people in the system, they don't respond fearfully to the new people. But I do think that, you know, if we expect to enter the barn or need to enter the barn, we still need to have that human acclimation happening, because it is going to be different in terms of all the sensory modalities from a robot, and they're gonna pick up on those differences and respond to them.
Yeah. There are no more questions in the chat, but I still have one question from my end here.
Okay.
Now, and this will take us to the issue of food sustainability. How does a cage-free system, what role does it play in terms of food sustainability?
Yeah, that's a great question, because, you know, we're trying to improve the welfare and we're trying to address issues of human social sustainability, right? In terms of acceptability and kind of license to farm by doing these systems that let the chickens have the good welfare. But at present, there's often a bigger environmental footprint for these systems. So you have less hens maybe per unit of building space. So how do we overcome that without then just crowding the hens even more, or, you know, doing things that maybe are going to not match with their behaviors? So we have to balance that environmental part. And because they are bigger systems, and because there's more human labor required to do things like collect the eggs from the litter, or if you have a human go through the barn to check, they've got to spend time going up and down so that they can see the hens at the top and look for mortalities or injuries or things. So the labor cost goes up. The economics of heating it goes up because you don't have as much bird body heat. And then you're providing something like litter as well, which is another resource. So yeah, the economics and the environmental footprint are still not quite perfect. So I do think that it is important to not just keep running with the systems we have, but before we keep putting all of our effort into transitioning to the current cage-free housing systems, to keep working on adjusting these designs. You know, how can we still do things in a better way? Are there other things that we need to consider that can make it better integrated, right? And then other things too, like, can we extend the life of an individual flock in a humane way, rather than putting resources into rearing more birds and then resources into culling and disposing of hens, right? So, but only if we can do that in a way that doesn't just let the hen basically become so worn out by the end that she is probably going to be in pain or discomfort or things like that. So those are other things that we can think of too, in terms of making that more sustainable.
Thank you so much. Still on that question, I was just wondering if birds in a cage-free system tend to have this freedom to express their behavior, but also we shouldn't forget that they are more susceptible to disease, you know, infection, because they get in touch with different birds and the litter and a lot of things. But in terms of extending the life span, you know, of these birds, what can really be done? Because it is something that is very, very interesting, because like what you said, if there is a way of extending their productive lifespan, then it will reduce the number of animals that are being produced, you know, year in, year out. So what are the things that you think can be done to help extend the productive lifespan of these laying birds?
So one potential, so of course, if we rear the birds better, then they're going to be stronger and more fit and more capable of being in the system from the get-go. So we'll have birds that are already adapted and ready to thrive. And so even as they age, they should still be doing better in that system, perhaps, than birds that weren't so well adapted. But there's other ways that we can think of configuring things. Like right now, we usually only have one nest level, but maybe we could have two nest levels. Because if the birds of the higher hierarchy are usually getting access to the resources, if we create additional provisions or more easily accessible space by making it lower so the birds who are less mobile can still access the nest, then maybe that will help them too. So how do we figure out the balance of configuration so that we can actually support hens of different abilities or different social rank so that they maybe can thrive longer, even if they're not the hen who's always first at the food trough or first in the nest? So are there ways that we could partition the system or continue to think about different ways of offering resources that meet the needs of more hens?
Well, I'm still coming back to that, but let me take a question from the chat box.
Okay.
Yeah, from Enva.
Why are we behind? Oh, so many reasons.
So what do you think about the reason why North America is behind the EU countries in terms of animal-friendly housing systems?
Some of it simply has to do with our scale and how big our systems got before there was an impetus to change. When we started housing animals indoors back in the 50s and 60s, we went like all in and we kind of went crazy. And we probably did. So once you have those systems in place, they're expensive, right? And so if you're going to try to make changes, that is a massive cost for the farmer to bear. And right now, nobody else is actually bearing that cost. So that is part of our problem, is kind of our structure in terms of the vertical integration, where a farmer has to meet the ultimate customer's demands, but the farmer isn't often given the extra money to actually go back in and support the systems. So that's part of it. The economics are a little bit screwy, and the people who need to make the changes don't have the money to do so. But there's also a bit of an American cowboy mentality where we really don't like being told what to do. And farmers in particular have that mentality. And so as soon as you start to try and turn something into a law rather than a voluntary program, they're going to run the other direction just because, which is not great, but sometimes that happens. Now, that's not true, of course, of all of them. There are some of them who would love to jump into this and do it and have so many ideas for even making it better. But that part of it, I think we got so good at production efficiency that we were really reluctant to give that up.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I think he's satisfied.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Like I said I have a follow-up question. If a hen finds it difficult to get an appropriate nesting site, she tends to become frustrated, trying to look for a place to lay the egg. And during this process, there's the possibility that the egg is being retained for a longer time. And this could lead to more, is it the calcification? Addition
Mm-hmm.
of, is it calcium? Yeah.
It could be that or egg binding. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How, will I say this is a painful process for the hen, trying to hold back,
Mm-hmm.
the egg instead of, because she's still trying to look for a comfortable nesting site.
Yeah, so there's both the immediate consequences of her discomfort, right, with trying to retain an egg, and the frustration she's experiencing with not being able to find a suitable nest site. So she's probably, in the farmer's eyes, she'd be wasting energy and you're not getting an egg right away. And if she becomes so frustrated that she lays somewhere else instead, then the egg is probably not going to be recovered well. So there's that from the producer perspective. And of course, the hen is immediately feeling that frustration, that discomfort. But then there's also going to be potentially the longer term consequences, right? If this happens repeatedly to a hen, or she retains an egg for so long, then what if you have an egg, decalcify, break, whatever inside the hen, and you start to have actual, infection and problems, and then she's unable to lay, and now you've lost a laying hen out of the system. So again, obviously very bad for her welfare, because she's just kind of going to experience slow death because, you know, it can be quite hard to go in and detect all the hens that are in early stages of a problem that is ultimately going to be fatal. So you can't, you know, intervene to euthanize in a quick fashion. But then, you know, of course, again, you have both a double negative in terms of the economic downside. But it's very interesting because, you know, you still have producers that are sort of fighting against providing dedicated nest space. And they say, oh, well, the hen can both nest and live in this space at the same time. Or when we've kind of show sometimes very tight peaks in when hens want to lay during the day, then you should provide more nest space because you have a greater demand for that use. Whereas other strains, like we found our white leghorns, they spread out, they're laying a lot more. Now, whether they want to or not, we don't know. But they seem to adapt to limited less nest space by laying over a longer stretch. And our brown birds, they still lay in a tight window, but they just put more eggs on the floor.
Oh.
So that's something I don't think the producers have fully come to grips with, at least the ones that we've been working with in the US, with acknowledging that they need to think about this a little differently. And even though they might not want to invest in extra space for that resource, ultimately, it's probably going to be beneficial if they do think about how to do that.
Our next webinar will be on the 18th of October, and it's going to be on zoo animals and research, the applications to welfare and beyond. So you see that the Animal Welfare Group Nigeria is not only about farm animals. We try to cover different aspects of different category of animals. And then the last, which will be the 11th virtual inaugural lecture, will be in December 20th. That would be on positive welfare by Professor Alistair Lawrence. So please, if you are yet to follow us on our social media platforms on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, please, you follow us, and then from there you can get information on, you know, how to register for subsequent meetings. And also, we have most of our presentations have been uploaded on the YouTube channel. There's also Animal Welfare Group Nigeria. So feel free to use those resources. You can, you know, share it with your students. When they listen, you can discuss topics and things around it. So thank you so much, Janice, for your time. And we appreciate you for sharing insight on this topic. And at least we know that there is the possibility in trying to understand the behavior of hens in a cage-free system, and also to see that there's a whole lot of research that is still yet to be done in this area. And I believe very soon, you know, most of the problems that we still have can be solved through research. And also, we're also here to advocate for cage-free system and to see how far we can go about it. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And with that, I would like to say bye-bye for now and see you in our subsequent meeting. Thank you so much for joining us.